Hi, this is Ed Butler. I'm the author of Memory Lane Was a Gravel Road for 8 Generations, the second edition. I want to share with you a portion of chapter 15, which I titled Fighting for Their Freedoms. Fighting for their freedoms has been a Celtic tradition for centuries. Nearly all of my ancestors are of Celtic origin. Most of the ones I have researched moved to the New World for the opportunity to live life as they desired. I've not researched all family lines and probably have many other ancestors that have fought for what they believed in. I have mentioned the 4 MacNat brothers that fought in the American Revolution and the 3 sons of Mackie MacNat that fought in the War of 1812. I have the service record of all these men. I've never learned of an ancestor that fought in the war with Mexico in the 1830s or the Spanish-American War. Perhaps someday I will find time to search for an ancestor that fought in these wars. Someone in my family has fought in all recent wars except the most recent one. When my grandmother Butler died, grandfather thought he would be able to keep the family together and continue to farm the small acreage he owned. I don't know how long Granddad fought this battle, but with 3 small boys, one of them still in diapers, he definitely had his hands full. A few months later, Granddad moved his family into the home of Samuel Albar Croft, Dad's grandfather. Samuel joined the 12th Kentucky Cavalry, CSA, on August 24, 1863. The 12th Kentucky Cavalry was part of what was called the Kentucky Brigade, which was under the command of Lieutenant General Nathan Bedford Forrest. William Daniel Everett Sladen and Thomas Jefferson Butler also joined the 12th Kentucky Cavalry on that day. Uncle Dick Sladen was married to Fanny Butler, my granddad's oldest sister, and their service records pose more questions than they answer. All of these men were farmers. The census report from that period show that none of these men owned any slaves. Why would they leave comfortable homes and their families for a life in the saddle? Surely they had heard stories about life in the cavalry. There was nothing easy or comfortable about it. All of these men, plus Pa Croft's older brother William Congreve Croft, who was a veteran of the 31st Tennessee Infantry, and many more Confederate veterans in the West Kentucky, West Tennessee area, lived until Dad was in his 20s. A few lived until Dad was in his 30s. Many times he listened to stories these men told about their service in the Confederate cavalry or infantry units. He told these stories to family members, many of my friends, many times. One of the favorite stories was about Grandfather Butler's oldest brother, Uncle Jeff, in 1861. He lived with his father, Edward Gibbs Butler, on a farm north of Fulgham, Kentucky. Fulgham is on Highway 307, about 12 miles north of Fulton, and 20-some miles east of Columbus, Kentucky. Uncle Jeff had often expressed his desire to join the Confederate Army, but his dad strongly objected. In the summer of 1861, many Confederate troops marched past his house, headed to Columbus. The fighting bishop, General Leonidas Polk, was in command of infantry and artillery units stationed on the bluffs of the Mississippi. On November 7, 1861, Grant left Cairo, Illinois, with a fleet of transports and some gunboats and attacked Belmont, Missouri. Belmont is across the river from Columbus. Confederate forces had installed 140 cannons on the bluff in Columbus and stretched a large chain across the river to stop Federal ships from using the river. One of the cannons installed was an Anderson rifle, fondly referred to as Lady Polk. It was a 6.4-inch rifle gun that could shoot a 128-pound shell a distance of 3 miles. The day of the battle, Grant moved some of his gunboats close enough to Belmont to shell Confederate lines. Lady Polk and some of the larger guns that had been installed were used to drive the gunboats back up the river. The flood of 1927 uncovered part of the huge chain that had been cut by the invading forces and left in the river. Part of that chain and some of the cannons can be seen at Columbus Belmont State Park, which was developed by the state of Kentucky on the bluffs at Columbus in later years. The day of the battle, Uncle Jeff heard the sound of the big guns being fired. He could stand it no longer. That night he slipped away from home and walked about 25 miles to Columbus to join the Confederate Army. Much to his dismay, he was not accepted in the Army that day and had to walk back home. I have often visualized his trip back. According to Dad's description of Uncle Jeff, he was a small but stoutly built Irishman. I can picture him in a state of rage because he was not accepted. He probably kicked every road apple he passed and about everything else he encountered. On November 7, 1861, Uncle Jeff was only 11 years and 24 days old. Late in the war, he might have been allowed to enlist. The South would not take an 11-year-old child. If you do not know what road apples are, you need to follow the horses in the next Christmas parade. When Uncle Jeff joined the 12th Kentucky Cavalry in August 1863, he was 12 years and 10 months old. He surrendered in April 1865 at the ripe old age of 15 years and 6 months. The last entry of his service record states that he was 5 feet 3 inches tall. I doubt that he weighed much over 100 pounds. He was about a 2.5-year veteran of the hardest fighting, hardest riding, most determined cavalry unit that ever straddled a horse. Every person that reads this account either was, is, or will be a 15-year-old child. The determination and desire of General Forrest was well known by both rebels and Yankees. When not on campaign, he was always trying to provide everything he could for his troopers. On a campaign, he was very demanding and required total discipline and obedience to every order. What could possibly motivate a mere child to volunteer to accept the duties, hardships, and responsibilities in serving in one of General Forrest's cavalry units? Some people attempt to explain the efforts of men like Uncle Jeff by saying they fought to preserve slavery. But anyone that can read should read the United States Constitution. There are 3 clauses in that Constitution that protected the institution of slavery. They are still in the Constitution, but are invalid because of the 13th Amendment that was passed in December 1865. For any clause to be adopted as a part of the Constitution, they were discussed at length and voted on by the representatives from each state that was present. All slave ships registered in the colonies were based in the coastal New England states. Some of these states voted to include those clauses in the Constitution. Slavery was a national institution. It was not just a Southern thing. That war that killed or mutilated over 1 million Americans did not free the slaves. Neither did the Emancipation Proclamation. It was the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, that freed the slaves.
So what was the war really about?
Well, since the war did not free slaves, what was the war fought over? And the simplest answer to that question is a 5-letter word that is still, after thousands and thousands of years, is the root of all evil. The war was fought about money. When Lincoln was elected president of these United States, he quickly found out that over 70 to 75% of the money paid to the federal treasury was money paid by Southern farmers, Southern people, most of it tariffs or taxes on farm equipment or agriculture or farm products. The war was all about money.